this is A-level psychology. This is year 2, and we're looking specifically at this part here, localization of function in the brain, and we're looking at evaluating that. So the first thing, what we've looked at in class is localization theory, where different parts of the brain perform different tasks and are involved with different parts of the body. For example, if I want to use my right hand for something, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the signals for that are coming from the left hemisphere of the brain, and specifically from an area on the motor cortex. And we've looked at quite a few examples of that in class. The main opposing idea to this is a holistic theory, where we could think about, are all parts of the brain involved in processing thoughts or actions? Rather than trying to zero in on like one tiny bit of the brain and say that bit's responsible, shouldn't we be looking at the whole brain together, and seeing which different parts are responsible? Or could the whole brain be working together, different areas in the brain, at the same time to produce some kind of action or thought? So that's the big opposite idea to localization theory. Rather than it being one specific bit, should we look at the brain as a whole? We'll start off, though, by looking at the evidence that suggests that localization theory is true. And we've actually looked at a number of things in class that you could talk about. For example, Penfield's work, where he went down the cortex and stimulated it, the motor cortex, and mapped it to sensations on different parts of the body. That's a really good example of that. And another thing that you can talk about is Peterson in 1988. He used brain scans, and he looked at Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And he found that when he gave someone a listening task, it was Wernicke's area that was being used to understand what was being said. But when they had to read aloud, for example, it was Broca's area that was active because they were producing speech. So that's quite good evidence for localization theory of the brain, because it's two specific localized areas, as you know, on the left hemisphere of the brain, and it suggests that we are using different areas for different tasks. So that's quite a good piece of evidence for localization theory. Then we've got evidence from neurosurgery. So OCD patients, when you have quite severe OCD, one of the last resorts after you've tried various other treatments is brain surgery, and you can have something called a cingulotomy, which is where they go into the central part of your brain, the limbic system, and they go to the cingulate gyrus, and they make a lesion in it. They basically remove a very small part of your brain, called the cingulate gyrus. And what actually happens is there's quite a good success rate from this operation. 30% of people recover completely, but there's also 14% of people recover partially on top of that. And that's actually a statistically significant improvement. And if you think about OCD, quite a complex mental disorder with lots of different symptoms going on that interact in different ways. Actually, the fact that it can be cured completely by destroying a little part of the brain does suggest that for mental disorders, localization is true, that specific little parts of the brain have a really key role in mental illness, or at least in OCD. So that's another piece of evidence for localization theory. And the last piece of evidence that we're going to look at is the case of Tan, who was a patient of Broca's. And after Tan died, Tan was a patient that Broca had who could only say the word Tan. Broca worked with him over a number of weeks and months and found that he understood what was going on. He was just unable to produce speech other than this word tan, which he often said twice, tan, tan, which was where his name came from. And after Tan died, Broca did a post-mortem on him and found that he had a lesion in a specific area in his left frontal lobe. here's a picture of his brain at post-mortem, and you can see there it's quite an obvious lesion there where part of the brain has been destroyed. And that suggested that the production of speech came from that specific area. And it wasn't just Tan who had this. A few weeks later, another patient with similar symptoms died, and the post-mortem was repeated and the lesion was found in the same place. Now, obviously, we have to be careful about using case studies, as you know, for evidence, and that's something that if you're looking at doing a more complex discussion in an essay, you could talk about the fact that it's great that we've got these two post-mortems as evidence for localization, but we don't know, there were other things wrong with Broca. You don't know, you can't control because you don't know what they were like beforehand when they were healthy. All sorts of problems with generalizing to everyone from one or two cases. But that's obviously not the only evidence for Broca's area. There's quite a lot of evidence built up that suggests that Broca's area is the area which is of the brain which is responsible for the production of speech. Okay, so that was the evidence for localization theory. Let's imagine now that we actually don't think that localization theory is true. Here's some things that could perhaps question whether it's true or not. And the first thing is plasticity. So sometimes when a patient has a stroke, when someone has a stroke, the blood supply is cut off to that area of the brain and that a specific area dies, they lose a certain function. So let's imagine someone has a stroke and the blood supply is cut off in the motor cortex so that they then can't use their right arm. What happens often after that is they can have therapy, physical therapy, over a long period of time. And what happens is the brain reorganizes itself to recover that lost function. So instead of the dead part of the brain controlling the right hand in that case, what will happen over time is that another part of the brain will take over that responsibility, and that person will often regain at least some function and they'll start to be able to move their right hand again. And we'll study that more when we go on and look at brain plasticity, which we have a whole lesson on later. But that's a big thing against localization theory, because if we're saying that a specific bit of the brain is responsible for a specific function, then actually the brain shouldn't necessarily be able to take on another function. It's another part of the brain would be taking over that function. So that questions whether that's really true, whether localization theory is really true, because if any part of the brain can take on any function, then it's not necessarily as straightforward as localization theory implies. The second theory was come up with by Lashley, called Equipotentiality theory. And Lashley did this really interesting experiment where he put rats in a maze and he wanted to test how well they could learn and memorize their way out of the maze, basically. And what he did was he removed different parts of the rat's cortex. So he did lots of different experiments where he removed different bits of it. Sometimes he just removed 10% of the cortex, sometimes he removed up to half of the cortex. And what happened was, actually, he found that it didn't affect learning. However much or which bits of the cortex he removed, they were still able to learn how to get out of the maze and to memorize it, which suggests that learning and memory are too complex to be localized, and that actually they use the whole brain. If it's still able to take place when half of your cortex has been removed and it's happening in the other half, then that does suggest that learning is something that is simply not localized in the brain. So that's quite a significant piece of evidence against localization theory. The last bit is called Integrated Communication, this point, and it suggests that actually, it's not specific areas of the brain that make the difference. It's actually the way that they communicate. So, for example, Dejerine found that damage to the connection between the visual cortex and Wernicke's area caused the loss of ability to read. So it wasn't, in his case, it wasn't damaging Wernicke's area that caused the loss of ability to read. It was actually the connection between the visual cortex and Wernicke's area. So actually that's suggesting that what we might have is lots of different parts of the brain, perhaps even specific parts, but lots of different bits of the brain communicating with each other and working together to carry out a specific function. So what might happen is you want to carry something out, you have a message from one part of the brain to another part, to another part, to another part. And actually, if you damage any one of the connections between that, then that would cause the loss of the function. So we shouldn't, this integrated communication idea suggests that we shouldn't be saying, well, this bit of the brain causes this action. We should be looking more at the process of how, of messages that perhaps move around the brain and how the whole brain works together and communicates to perform specific tasks. Okay, that is the end of this particular topic.